joining me now is author of the popular Bitcoin book, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, Vijay Boyapati. Vijay, so nice to see you.
Great to see you too, Natalie.
You know what? A lot of people are feeling bearish about Bitcoin. What about you? Are you feeling bullish or bearish in the market conditions we have right now?
I think it's pretty clear that we are in a bear market right now. For those of us who've been around Bitcoin I've been, looking at Bitcoin and observing it for over a decade. This is clearly a bear market. And I think there are some things that are unique about this bear market that are different to the past. For instance, the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates. That hasn't really happened in a big way in the last decade. They've been very easy with their monetary policy. So that's something that's quite different. And the market's also much, much bigger. So it's matured a lot, and there are different risks at play now today than they were in, say, 2012 and 2017.
Yeah, well, you talked about some of those risks in your book, the risk of rehypothecation and of Federal Reserve policy. Can you talk about either or both of those for the audience?
Yeah, so rehypothecation is the idea that you post collateral to a financial institution like BlockFi, and then they lend out the collateral that you post. And the benefit to you, if you give your Bitcoin to BlockFi, is you get interest, and then BlockFi lends it out for a higher interest rate and it collects the difference. The real problem to the financial system occurs when the lending is irresponsible. And what we've seen in the last year or so is that there's been a lot of irresponsible lending in the crypto financial system, and so you've seen the collapse of the Terra Luna ecosystem recently. You've also seen the collapse in the last week of Three Arrows Capital, which is a really large hedge fund managing $18 billion of capital. And what happens is the financial institutions that have lent out Bitcoin to cover their own losses, they will start selling the collateral asset. And the collateral asset is Bitcoin. And so what's happened is you've had this cascade of selling where institutions collapse, and then the lenders will sell Bitcoin to cover their losses. That will drive the price of Bitcoin and other altcoins down. And then you get more collapses in other institutions who have been betting on altcoins, for instance, or betting on something like Terra Luna. And it sort of feeds on itself, and it becomes this feeding frenzy. And you get this mass liquidation event, which is what we saw last week. We saw a massive liquidation event where a bunch of institutions failed in quick succession, and the lenders, covering themselves, sold Bitcoin to cover the losses. And that drove Bitcoin down very, very quickly into the teens. So rehypothecation is a risk when Bitcoin is lent out irresponsibly. That's one of the big risks. It was the same thing that happened in the financial crisis with the housing market, where people lent out mortgage debt and then lend it out over and over again, and it created this contagion in the financial system. We're seeing the equivalent in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And driving all of this actually is the Federal Reserve, which is the other risk I wanted to talk about. This is the first bear market where the Federal Reserve is really aggressively increasing interest rates. And in my book, I talk about how Federal Reserve policy is actually a risk to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has now achieved macro scale. It's a macro asset, a global macro asset, kind of in the same family as gold. And we know that gold can be affected by Federal Reserve policy, because when the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, it means you get interest on your money in the bank. And that creates a disincentive to own something like gold, which has no natural interest. So this is actually unprecedented for Bitcoin. We've never seen this. And I actually think it makes sense that Bitcoin would fall in an environment like this, because it's the same thing that happened to gold in the 80s when Paul Volcker increased interest rates to 20%. So we should expect that Bitcoin, just like gold being a monetary asset, will be affected by Federal Reserve policy.
Well, last question. You mentioned Volcker. Last time we didn't have this much debt in the system, and the Fed seems very intent on maintaining that idea of tightening, tapering. What do you think is going to happen? Is something going to break in the system, and then we're going to see Bitcoin drop even lower, but then bounce from a true bottom?
Yeah, that's a great question. The fiscal constraints are much greater today than they were in 1980. The debt position of the US is over 100% of GDP. Back when Volcker was the Federal Reserve chairman, it was 40%. So that actually, it's hard for the Federal Reserve to increase too much, because then it makes it so the federal government can't service their debt anymore. It would become too expensive to service the debt. But they can increase interest rates significantly for a short period of time. And I think it's worth considering that as something that may happen. If you're a Bitcoin investor, it's certainly possible. But I do believe, just as you said, the Federal Reserve eventually will have to change course. And that's when Bitcoin will rocket up, because Bitcoin and gold as well thrive in negative interest rate environments. And we will see those again in the future, because the Federal Reserve's habit is to have easy money. This is actually an anomaly, what we're seeing right now.
That's right. Such great points you raised. I know a lot of people are looking for that melt up rally. Vijay, thank you so much and congratulations on extending your family.
Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate it.